Hi, welcome back to another edition of Technique Tuesday and part 2 of our closer look at the force velocity curve. Today we're going to be talking about how we use aspects and concepts of the curve to help periodize our off-season training programs, right? And the periodization model that we predominantly use at the gym is kind of a hybrid blend of concurrent and conjugate periodization models, right? And without taking too deep of a dive into the periodization rabbit hole, although we will spend a little bit of time there discussing the different periodization types and the ones that are pertinent to us. But let's just start by defining a couple of these terms and kind of how we use them and where they show up. Okay, so first things first, let's just talk about defining periodization, right? What is periodization? And periodization is defined as a systematic type of resistance training that involves specific training phases. Okay, so now that we have defined periodization and understand what that means and hopefully have a little bit more context going into these next discussions, where the first thing we're going to talk about is just the two different periodization models that I just mentioned that we predominantly use at the gym. And the first one is that concurrent periodization model. So the simplest way to define this particular model would be the idea that you are training multiple physical qualities at the same time, right? So meaning that you aren't necessarily just chasing after one specific training adaptation, and instead you're trying to really improve upon each physical attribute, right? So examples being strength, speed, power, work capacity, etc., right? And this particular training model or periodization model is really reserved more so for our athletes with a younger, lower training age, because of the simple fact that they have the most room to improve upon basically every physical quality. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at the conjugate model, right? And from first glance, it can look pretty similar to the concurrent model, but when you dig a little bit deeper and you take a little bit of a closer look at it, you can just tell that there's a little bit more depth to it, and really depending on kind of which conjugate method you subscribe to, it can get fairly complicated, right? And that's kind of one of the reasons why it's really generally reserved for more of our advanced athletes and athletes with just a higher training age. Okay, so it's impossible to talk about the conjugate method without at least mentioning Louie Simmons and his gym Westside Barbell. And if you're a strength and conditioning coach of any kind, you should definitely know who Louie is. But if you're not familiar with Louie and his work, Louie is the one that basically ultimately kind of brought the conjugate periodization method to the United States and made it really popular. And Louie's conjugate system really has kind of become its own system or periodization model in it of itself. And that system or that periodization model is now just known simply as the Westside method. And that's a method that strength and conditioning coaches of all kinds continue to borrow concepts from Louie's Westside method. So one important thing to note is that there are multiple different kinds or variations of different conjugate methods that are out there. And Louie's Westside method is not the only conjugate method that is available or that is out there, right? If we're simply just trying to define the conjugate model, like I had previously stated, it can sound and look a lot like a concurrent model where you're simultaneously trying to train multiple physical attributes at the same time, right? And so the conjugate model that we have kind of adopted or kind of pieced together over the years can look a lot like a concurrent model, like we've talked about, but it can also show up or look a lot like kind of a classic linear block periodization model as well. Okay, so the knock on the classic linear block periodization model has always been that during each individual training block, you are only focusing on training one physical quality at a time, right? Or you're only chasing after one specific training adaptation at a time. Therefore, you're going to lose the adaptations that you had previously made in prior training blocks. Okay, so to better describe this, let's take a look at the force velocity curve and kind of use the example of if we were in a training block, right, in kind of a classic linear block periodization model like we just talked about, and we were only training for peak power and we weren't continuing to sprinkle in some strength speed and some max strength, then we would lose these qualities or these adaptations that we had previously gained in the prior training blocks, right? Like the old saying, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So that is where, in my opinion, the conjugate method separates itself from that classic linear block periodization model, where it still kind of looks like it, right? Where we're still going to have a particular emphasis for each training block, but where the conjugate model is superior to the classic block periodization model is that as we continue to work our way down the curve and we move from training block to training block, there is still a huge emphasis on holding on to the qualities that you had previously made in the prior training block, right? So that's where, again, in my opinion, I feel like the conjugate model is far better for athletes. So we'll use our kind of MLB, MILB off-season training program as an example of kind of what it looks like along the curve, right? And it really depends a lot on when our guys finish up their season and when they start trickling back into the gym. But generally, you know, everybody's going to start kind of, whether that's October or November, everyone will start with kind of a GPP phase, right, or a general physical preparedness phase, where we're just kind of getting them going again, getting them moving again, trying to just build back a base and foundation for these guys of kind of less extensive work that really will prepare them for more intensive work as we get later into the off-season training program and really just kind of further down the curve, right? So right after we start really up here kind of off the curve, or before we get onto the curve, right, they're in that phase of GPP, or, you know, some of you might refer to it as like an anatomical adaptation phase. But once they get through that phase, then we're going to just start working our way down the curve, right? So if we're looking at max strength, and this can be, you know, it's more often than not, it's going to start with kind of like a hypertrophy phase and then kind of build up to a max strength phase. But we'll start here, and this is going to be kind of more of like our November, December. We'll spend, you know, 4 to 5 weeks there. Then we're going to move down the curve, right? We're going to go down to our strength speed phase, right? While we're still sprinkling in some of this max strength where we're able to hold on to some of those qualities. But once we move down here to our strength speed phase, right, this is going to look a little bit more like some accommodating resistance, where we're putting some chains and bands on some bars, whether that's, you know, more times than not, it's going to be a trap bar deadlift that we've got bands and chains on. Okay, and then we're just going to keep moving down into kind of more of some of a peak power phase, and then when we get closer kind of January, February, that's where we're getting into more max velocity stuff. Some of the training is taking a little bit of a backseat to more specific baseball stuff, where we're, you know, our pitchers are starting to throw more often as they're gearing up for spring training, right? So we just kind of follow along the curve, right, where we're starting up here in that max strength phase that is going to go, like I said, kind of November, December, January, and kind of into January, February-ish, but a lot of it depends on when we get the guys and how quickly we need to get started and moving throughout the training off-season program and get them ultimately ready to go perform in spring training. So that gives you hopefully a better look at how we use that curve to periodize our off-season programs. We'll do one more kind of part 3 next time, where we'll dig a little bit deeper into the actual exercises that we use for each phase there. Okay, so stay tuned next time. Thanks for hanging with me. I know I dove a little bit deeper into the periodization rabbit hole than I had originally planned on, but hopefully it gives you great context moving forward to kind of part 3 of this, where I'll, like I said, dig a little bit deeper into the exercise selection for each phase. If you liked it, please share it, and if you have any questions, shoot them in the comments, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks a lot.